Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our first NACD New England webcast, Incentive Programs in the Age of Rapid Business Change. I'm Ellen Richstone. I'm a sitting public company board director, member of the NACD New England Chapter's Board of Directors, and the current chair of the program committee. In addition to today's webcast, we have several upcoming programs that may be of interest to you. Please consider joining us for our May and June breakfast topics on crisis management and activist shareholders, respectively, and our Director Education Bootcamp events, one for experienced public company directors, and the second for those people who wish to sit on public company boards. Today, our distinguished panel will be sharing their insight and experiences dealing with the new normal of a rapidly changing business environment. We'll discuss how many of these changes may impact incentive compensation programs and how to best address its impact within the context of your company's overall business strategy. We're joined by Matt Mulberger, Vice President with Executive Compensation Consultancy firm Perlmeyer, and panel members Karen Barsa, who currently sits on the Board of Directors of Deckers Outdoor Corporation, and Martin Van Walsum, who is Vice President, Executive Compensation for Thermo Fisher Scientific. Before we begin, Kelly Savada with Perlmeyer has a few housekeeping announcements.
Thank you, Ellen. The slides are available for download at our website. You can see the link information right there. If you're listening through your computer speakers, a secure internet connection will provide the best audio quality. For a wireless connection, it's recommended that you mute your speakers and dial into the audio portion. The webcast will be recorded and all lines will be muted during the presentation. If you need technical help, please dial *0. If you have questions, they may be submitted at any time using the chat feature, and we will reach them at the conclusion of the event. To view the slides in full screen mode, please click the full screen icon to the right above the slides. I'll now turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Kelly. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our program, Incentive Programs in the Age of Rapid Business Change. I'd like to welcome our panelists today, Karen Barsa and Martin Van Walsum. Hi, Karen. Hi, Martin.
Good morning, or good afternoon.
Hello.
And thank you both for joining me today. We're living in an age of change. Companies face constant change and are continuously evolving. Some of this change is intentional, which we call change in control. This is the type of change that companies typically pursue to remain competitive and deliver value to shareholders. And some change is beyond a company's control. But both types of change have implications for designing and administering incentive compensation programs. Today we are going to discuss approaches to facing change and learn from Karen and Martin's experiences. Our agenda today is to cover 3 topics. First, planning for change. Then we'll talk about what committees have done to handle unexpected change, particularly as it relates to their incentive compensation programs. And lastly, we'll learn from those experiences to discuss what can be done to plan for future unexpected change. So my first question this afternoon is for Karen. Karen, as a committee chair or member, what is the foundation for planning for business change?
Matt, thanks so much. You know what? I think that Martin will agree that foremost, trust between the board and management is really key here. So important to maintaining that trust, I think, is that the board should speak with one voice as much as possible. And to that end, board committees, I think, shouldn't be seen just as silos that exist to get work done, but instead committee chairs and the lead director or chairperson of the board should meet quite often to understand what each committee, from each committee's purview, what should be done by the board to support the strategic direction of the company. So, you know, I think that naturally in discussions like that, we'll talk about risks and opportunities related to that strategic direction. And so these discussions will help the board develop at least a philosophical foundation for how they might address change that occurs that is both expected and unexpected. So I think that philosophical foundation is really key before you even begin to design a comp program.
And Martin, what is management doing to help prepare the committee to face change?
Matt, it's interesting. As I look back on my career, I've been with now just 2 companies in the last 17 years, but I somehow or other wound up creating a bit of a niche in terms of, in both instances, I was called upon to add cohesiveness to the relationship between the compensation committee specifically and senior leadership. I'll stop short of saying it was dysfunctional, but it wasn't operating as well as it could. So my role is to foster a relationship over the course of time between senior leaders and the committee that's based on trust, as Karen mentioned. And then with that trust, we can leverage that when a critical juncture is reached so that the senior leaders and the committee are speaking with one voice, that there's not a level of discord in those 2 groups in terms of how are we going to approach a particular situation that we saw coming or potentially didn't see coming.
And Karen, is change evolving the role of the committee?
Oh, I'd say absolutely. First of all, as I mentioned, the meetings of committee chairs, or what you might call an executive committee of the board, becomes, I think, far more important as change increases in frequency and perhaps severity as our sort of globalized economy now predicts. So I think that the role of the comp committee specifically is also evolving because the comp committee should have a much broader purview than just designing compensation programs for Section 16 officers. So I think that the comp committee should have some purview into all HR-related functions, including management succession and evaluation of the CEO and CFO, not as a land grab, but basically to be able to work in tandem with management to say, okay, we understand what's going on in the organization. We're taking all of this into account as we talk with you about designing comp programs, and we're just that much more empowered, if you will, and intelligent about what we're doing.
And Martin, specifically at Thermo Fisher, have you seen the same thing? Is the purview of the committee expanding?
Yes, very much so. We have one meeting, and one of our longer ones actually, that's devoted exclusively to doing a high-level human resources review, and also to be talking about succession planning from the CEO on down. So again, those can prepare the committee for unforeseen changes where something happens that we didn't expect, an executive leaves, or whatever the case may be. It's a reasonable expectation that, and I would encourage anyone attending the call, that management should be held accountable to preparing the committee for foreseen change. And if the committee is prepared properly for the things that we expect to happen with a high level of transparency, when things occur that we didn't expect to see happen, I think everyone is better prepared to deal with those situations.
Yeah, and I want to add to in addition to what Martin is saying, is that if the comp committee has a very broad purview and understands what the objectives are for HR programs throughout the organization and for succession planning, et cetera, the comp design for Section 16 officers and other senior leaders is that much more intelligent. So I don't see that as a problem, and I'm hoping, Martin, maybe you can comment on whether or not that sort of relationship is a smooth one in your experience.
Well, I guess it doesn't always start out smooth, but I would definitely say that over the course of time it does smooth out. When I started with Thermo Fisher in 2008, one of the things that the CHRO pulled me aside and said, by the way, just so you're prepared, you'll never get a note of thanks from this CEO or from this committee. And I kind of jokingly said that that was unacceptable, that if I do good work, I expected to be recognized for it. I finished my first meeting, and one of the comp committee members pulled me aside and said, "That was great. You really did a nice job. Thank you for bringing that level of information to us." And the CEO pulled me aside and said, you did a really nice job." So for whatever reason that expectation had been built prior, it was based probably more on the personalities that were involved. And if we get to a good place, then there should be an open and honest dialogue between both sides in dealing with any issues.
Oh, that's terrific. That's music to my ears as a director.
So as we think about planning for change, and we think about the role that the long-term business strategy plays in, Karen, what anchors your incentive plan design process?
Matt, thanks so much for asking that. I really think that the board and management must have what I'll call a North Star, and that is it's a measurable long-term goal. Now, for public companies and other shareholder-driven organizations, I think this North Star should really comprise relative TSR, or total shareholder return, with an objective to be within the top quartile in that particular industry group for relative TSR. This really is an anchor for incentive plan design, with the long-term incentive programs sort of designed around it, and short-term incentive plans designed to keep the company on track. Now, I want to say directly here, lest we think that a North Star goal should be evidenced just by financial metrics, I believe that there are softer metrics that should be included as well. These sort of metrics would help to guide way of being, if you will, for not only for individuals on the management team, but also for the company as a whole. There are certain companies that for which market positioning and perhaps consumer trust in the brand and what have you is very, very important, and those should be parts of this sort of long-term North Star, if you will, objective.
And Karen, when there are short-term deviations on the path to the long-term goal, how do you keep management engaged and motivated as it pertains to the incentive program?
Well, I think you first have to management and the board should try to agree on the nature of the short-term deviation. Like, well, has it been caused by, say, temporary macroeconomic factors, or is it a long-term indication that the business model that we're operating with is no longer relevant? And I think when the board and management agree that the business model is still relevant, the North Star, if you will, goal is still relevant, then we can agree to say, what can we do in the short term to keep everything back on track, or get everything back on track towards that North Star. And so, your discussion around this can be either really broadly based around the organization as a whole and how it fits into the developing global economy, or it can be very specific to say, hey, what happened here in the short term and how do we get back on track? And, in my experience, we had a product recall, for instance, which is a short-term deviation from the company's overall overarching goal to become top quartile performers in our industry. And the question becomes, what the heck do we do about that? The majority of the board at the time felt that product recall should not affect the compensation programs related to the longer term goal, and so it was eliminated from consideration. There were others of us who felt that perhaps it should impact, because it's a way of evidence is a way of being that wasn't being attended to, and we should have had softer metrics that would take that into account. So, if the committee chairs and the lead director or the chair of the board are meeting periodically, these sorts of things don't cause as much angst, if you will, or indecision around comp programs as they can if you don't meet regularly and don't have that sort of philosophical foundation.
Martin, how does change factor into the long-term business strategy at Thermo Fisher?
Well, I think that a lot of what Karen just said is sort of applicable to the way that Thermo Fisher is run as well. We do set lofty goals for ourselves, and we do tend to track towards them. There may be short-term variations or bumps in the road, if you will, nothing like what Karen described, but at the same time, not everything goes perfectly all the time. I think that it's okay for there to be short-term deviations from the path, but the North Star stays the same. If something happens or occurs that's transformational, positively or negatively, then I think if we've determined that a new long-term strategy is appropriate, there has to be a level of agreement between the full board and the leadership team what that goal looks like. In our case, in 2010, we set some goals for ourselves of what the company would look like in 2020. One of those was that we would double the stock price, and that happened in 5 years instead of 10 years. So we redeveloped the goals to say, okay, we're ahead of schedule. That doesn't mean that we stop and get fat, dumb, and happy. Let's reset the goals to be loftier than they originally were. And we found the same thing in terms of revenue. We've done enough acquisition activity over the course of the last 5 years, 6 years that we're ahead of schedule there too. So in our case, these were positive changes that were impacting the North Star. But then we rallied around a new set of goals and continued to move forward towards the revised goals.
So as we think about actually designing a short-term annual bonus plan and a long-term incentive compensation plan, Martin, in our preparations, you referred to Thermo Fisher as being a serial acquirer. How does that impact actually designing the incentive compensation programs?
I think, Matt, what it does is it tells us we're always going to have change. There's not a single operating cycle we are ever going to go into where the company looks the same in December as it did in January. So, there's that eventuality of change that we're going to constantly deal with, and we know how to do that. We know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate to do. From there, I think it becomes a matter of the degree of change. So we may do 5 or 6 acquisitions a year, some of them relatively small, some of them larger. In 2014, we did a transformational acquisition of Life Technologies. It was about a $17 billion deal. And we had expected it to close prior to year end, but it didn't close until February because of antitrust clearance in Asia. So what we did was we made sure that there were appropriate guardrails that were set up around the annual incentive program so that the core business was being measured as well as the acquisitive business. It worked out well. We didn't wind up needing the guardrails, but we wanted to make sure that we put things in place so that management continued to have an incentive to perform. You don't want to you want management feeling as if they're out of the game early in the year. At the same time, that shareholders are being protected and their interests are being watched over. So in our case, on any given operating cycle, we'll have a different set of controls in place. But if we think about the relationship between salary, short-term incentives, and long-term incentives, particularly for the CEO, it's heavily weighted towards long-term incentives, and those long-term incentives should be geared towards the achievement of the North Star that Karen described. So the short-term variations, if we've got the right mix of fixed variable and long-term variable pay, and also the right mix of vehicles, any short-term deviation from the path should be something that we should be able to deal with without a disenfranchised management team.
And if I may add to that, Martin, I know a little bit about the way that you operate and some of the things that you advocate. And one of the things that I really love that you advocate is shorter-term measurement cycles. Now, a comp committee must respect the calendar for reporting purposes, and there's no doubt about that. But within that calendar, if you will, within that 12-month cycle or what have you, one can have shorter measurement purposes for if we know, for instance, that an acquisition is going to occur, perhaps there is behavior or financial metrics that we want to implement prior to that acquisition and then post-acquisition. So, I think as a comp committee, we tend to think that compensation program or incentive program designs should be 12-month programs. But in truth, they can be several months here, several months there, that sort of thing. It can be broken up into shorter time frames. and then the comp committee and management's purview might be actually better, or a viewpoint might be actually better as they look into the future from a new standpoint. So I love that that Martin operates that way and advocates that.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's something that we sort of get locked into there being a finite solution set, and there really isn't. We have both at Thermo Fisher Scientific and at my last company, Barnes Group. In both cases, we had a situation we were dealing with where things occurred that were not completely expected, and we were in the middle of trying to plan for our cycle for the coming operating period, the coming year. In both cases, what we arrived upon was that there was too much uncertainty for us to really be able to predict 12 months out what was likely to occur. So we fell upon a solution of using a semi-annual measurement period. We set the goals for the second semi-annual period, but with the proviso that when we got to July, we would take a look at that second set of goals that would then lead to the full year to decide whether, based upon the information that we now had as opposed to what we had 6 months prior, are those goals still the right ones, or do they need to be adjusted up or down? And I think in both cases it worked out really nicely. It provided us with the ability to sort of have confidence as we operated through the cycle that we were going to make sure that there was proper alignment by recalibrating if necessary.
I think that's great because, quite frankly, the one thing a comp committee does not want to have to be in the position to do is to consider positive discretion. That, even though it sounds like a wonderful thing, would just bring out the ire of shareholders and proxy advisory firms, et cetera, et cetera. So if we can actually set objectives and metrics and comp programs and what have you on shorter term time frames and still wind up with something comprehensive to report in the CD&A at the end of the year, then I think that's a major win.
So what I'm hearing here is that change in the way a committee handles the change really needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Martin, where Thermo Fisher is doing smaller add-on acquisitions, there may be an approach that works, but when there is a more transformative opportunity, you'll take a different approach. When there are market downturns, then an approach that worked in one particular time period might not work in another particular time period.
Yes, Matt, I do think that it needs to be individualized. I don't think that we can look to what we did last time or what other companies are doing for definitive guidance. So it provides any information that we have, enters into any decision that we all make. But I do think that the facts in a particular circumstance do need to be considered when arriving at the solution. It's not something that, and I found the same thing when I was Matt in your line of work. I would go to a compensation committee and would present them with a solution, and they'd say, "Well, this looks good, but where has it been used before, and was it successful?" And my response typically was, "It's not been used anywhere before because your solution set is different than any other company's. This is designed for you." And generally speaking, it was at least hopefully thoughtfully put together and worked. So it's something that does need to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. You've got a couple of studies in here, case studies that maybe I would agree with the solutions that were put in, maybe I wouldn't, but obviously I don't have all the facts. So once you know what's happening in a given situation, that's going to provide you with a greater level of guidance.
So let's shift to one of those case studies. As we think about the impact that an unexpected change can have on an incentive program, our first case study is a company that makes an acquisition mid-year. Now, in this particular example, the acquisition wasn't anticipated or budgeted for ahead of the year and during the annual goal-setting process. And so a short-term plan that's based on revenue and EPS growth has goals that are now gimmies. The company has a 3-year performance share program based on ROIC and relative TSR. And so the committee was faced with having to figure out what approach they wanted to use to administer this program. Now, on the short-term plan, the decision was to really maintain the intent of the plan. Since the acquisition would close in the third quarter, the company would be able to strip out the results from the acquisition and measure the short-term annual performance against the original goals. On the long-term plan, I think the company really had to balance a few things. One, the committee wanted to be fair to management, and so this acquisition was going to be pretty detrimental to the one-year ROIC performance, and so the committee elected to actually adjust the ROIC goal for that specific year. The committee wanted to hold the team accountable, though, and so it maintained the future ROIC goals. And given that there is a relative TSR component to this LTI program, I think the committee viewed it as an opportunity for management to truly be rewarded for its success in integrating the acquisition by driving the stock price performance. So, Martin, at Thermo Fisher, have you employed similar strategies or different strategies as you've handled M&A activity? Martin?
Sorry about that. Since we do acquisitions every year, it is somewhat built into the process of goal setting. And I would say that the philosophy that we tend to follow is guided by the fact that acquisitions are hard. Everyone that is involved in the process from the day that the target is identified until the operations are fully integrated, we tend to lean upon the same people a lot. And it doesn't mean that their day jobs go away. They have to do what their normal responsibilities are, and they have to make sure that the acquisition is going to be done at the right price, at the right time, and for the benefit of the shareholders. So we generally want to make sure that there is an incentive to do acquisitions. We have it as a soft goal, as Karen was referring to earlier, but that doesn't generally capture it well enough. There may be more that we're going to want to do. We only use organic revenue growth because revenue is really easy to add. Anybody can buy a company and add revenue, so we don't count that. We don't begin to count revenue until a year after the acquisition closes. The profitability, I do think that then it depends on how large the acquisition is. I think that if it were all of our acquisitions are accretive, so I think that we wouldn't do an acquisition that's expected to be dilutive. It's just one of our philosophies. I think the answer may be different if it's dilutive, but if it's very accretive, then we would want to make sure that we are anticipating that to the greatest extent possible and taking that back out. If it's only marginally accretive to a certain extent, then that's part of job well done. The shareholders benefited. It's okay if in our short-term incentives that it's having a positive impact, as long as it's not a materially positive impact.
I agree with everything that Martin has just said. And you know what? But I also love this example because Matt, the way that you positioned it, you said basically the company opted to keep the original intent of the incentive plan in place so that long term they were still shooting for, if you will, the same North Star or what have you. And I think similar situations come up when a company considers things like share repurchases or dividends or what have you that weren't necessarily contemplated in the original long-term plan for the company. So each time I think one has to ask how does this really affect or impact the long-term goal for the organization, and are we going to strip out the effects short-term so that we preserve the effects long-term for the incentive program design. And I think that's, generally speaking, that is a philosophy that I would apply each time. Is to say, how does this affect the long term, and let's maintain our focus on that. And in the short term, let's be certain that we are helping the organization guide itself towards the long-term expectation.
So as we advise companies on how to handle unexpected change, there are a few considerations that we like to think about as guidelines. The first one in our table here is the timing. At what point during the performance period did the event occur? And this is obviously critical because I think the way a committee would think about an acquisition or any type of event in January is very different than they would think about it if it happened in November or December. Materiality and accountability are also critical, though. So how material is the event on the quantitative incentive metrics? If there's going to be a really large impact, then I think the committee is forced to take action, whereas if the impact is calculated to be quite small, it's much easier to sit on the original goals and believe that the intent of the plan is still intact. And accountability, to what degree should management be held accountable? So Karen, you mentioned earlier a product recall. As part of that evaluation process, the committee has to consider to what extent is management accountable for that recall. Plan integrity, maintaining the original intent, and then also precedence. I think one of the issues, although like we said earlier, that we want to evaluate things on a case-by-case basis, we do also want to be careful about creating a precedent and making sure that is part of our evaluation process. Martin, what other considerations has your committee deliberated?
Well, I think in the lower right box, the 162M issue is one that committees do need to grapple with at times. In the first case study, you mentioned revising the ROIC goals, and that could wind up being, if it's deemed as positive discretion, could cost the company a 162M, the deductibility of certain elements of pay. I think it's important that the committee include in its charter and describe in the CD&A that there are going to be times where the foregoing a tax deduction is in the shareholders' best interest, and we should do so. We shouldn't simply continue to proceed because of what 162M tells us we need to do. I will also say that whenever we're trying to deal with uncertainty and predicting results, whether it be 1 year out, 3 years out, whatever, the only certainty is that the prediction is going to be wrong. We're either going to be too high or we're going to be too low. You can flip a coin and in theory it could stand on edge, but it doesn't happen. The probability of getting it 100% correct is not likely. So I mentioned earlier that guardrail concept of making sure that when you're modeling results, you're doing it in a way that is taking the parameters way beyond what is expected above and below and understanding the impact, and then putting the appropriate safeguards in place to ensure that when something does happen in an unexpected way, that management either is not being disadvantaged or overly advantaged. We see situations all the time where, the economy went against us and therefore we need to take this into account. And we all read about the stories in the Wall Street Journal about companies that lower their goals. But that same management team is not coming back when the economy was working in their favor to say, no, you're paying me too much. So that's where I think the transparency and trust need to come into play, where regardless of what may be happening that's impacting the outcome, the reaction should really be the same. It should be consistent from period to period, and not dealt with one way when it works against management and another way when it works for them. I can give you two examples.
Here, Martin. Excellent.
There are two things that occurred in the course of the last not so distant future. One was more recently FX, and another was a few years back, longer than that, where we had a more significant economic downturn than we anticipated. In both cases, the level of payout that would have been generated was not what the committee felt management deserved. It was the sentiment from the committee was that management performed superlatively given the circumstances and did everything possible to work within the parameters of the unexpected change and offered the opportunity to provide a nominal level of payout, certainly not full payout, but felt as if there had been enough done to warrant a payout. In both cases, and I probably am very lucky in the career choices that I've made, the response that we provided was thank you, but no. We are committed to making our numbers and working towards the long term. Stock price is down, or stock price would be down if we did what is being contemplated because of the added expense. And what we did do in both cases was we went to the committee and said, but we would like to have a small, not major, additional opportunity next year if we've done the right things and if we've literally have pushed off the bottom of the pool and are going to be able to come out with guns blazing in the new year. Let's set a stretch goal for ourselves that if we achieve that, then give us an opportunity to earn an additional amount. In our case, it was about a 20% premium in both cases, above what our short-term incentive would normally provide. In both cases, that was the solution that we landed on. In both cases, we actually maxed out against the stretch goal, and leadership came away feeling very good about getting that additional opportunity added to the following period.
Oh, Martin, this is Karen. I have to say that Thermo Fisher is so fortunate to have you on board because, quite frankly, I think that virtually everything should be within management's accountability purview. The only things that perhaps should not be are macroeconomic factors that one just could not anticipate, say currency exchange rates or a change, an unexpected or unforeseen change in regulation or something of that nature that would affect, or a general economic downturn that would affect the performance of the company. Also, when it comes to many retailers are facing this today, that their business plan is no longer as relevant as it once was. Well, quite honestly, it's up to management and the board to work together to develop a new strategy for that. So I don't necessarily think that plan integrity should be thrown by the wayside just because unexpected change happens. It's a matter of meeting that change, managing, developing a new strategy, and going with it. And always, if the North Star is basically to be the top quartile performer, that performance might be less, if you will, because the industry has been impacted, but still to be in the top quartile is really an incentive plan goal that should not change.
And Karen, I think you had an impairment charge example as well. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, it's interesting because whenever a company contemplates growth through acquisitions, there is certainly the viewpoint that acquisitions should be encouraged, as Martin has indicated, as part of their incentive program. And toward that end, many organizations feel that management should not be held responsible for impairment charges that might occur if a lot of money, a significant premium was paid for a company and it doesn't perform as expected. On the other hand, one might say, golly, impairment charges are important to include in the incentive plan design because it would keep management from overpaying for acquisitions and help keep one's eye on the ball in terms of performance of that acquired entity going forward. So I don't know that there is a right or wrong answer, but by golly, I think the board should be aligned on this before the question even comes up. So if goodwill is tested and impairment charges are indicated, the board at this point, and the comp committee especially, should not be scrambling to determine with management should this charge be included or not included. So I come back to general accountability saying, what do we want to incentivize? What is really within management's purview to manage? And therefore, there should be one strong answer, rightly or wrongly, on that question.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to take us to our next case study. We have a software company that, as part of its long-term business plan, is transitioning from a traditional license model to software as a service subscriptions. but they experienced a bit of an unexpected occurrence in that the conversions from traditional to SaaS happened at a quicker rate than expected. So when the company set up its revenue and EBITDA thresholds in the short-term plan at the beginning of the year, they were based on a projected mix, and to shareholders' best interest, the conversions started to happen quicker than expected. But the outcome was that the bonus plan funded at 0%, and the committee had to factor in that the 0% payout didn't really reflect the company's progress toward this long-term goal. And so the committee not only had to figure out what it wanted to do in terms of a payout for that given fiscal year, but they had to think about what the implications were for the future. Did they have the right performance metrics? Should they incorporate a corporate strategic goal component? Some companies operate with a 162 umbrella plan that would have provided the committee a bit more room to exercise its discretion. Karen, what's been your experience as a committee member balancing perceived performance with the actual quantitative results?
That's a great question, Matt. The bottom line is, in my mind, I have to say this, that management and the board should be held responsible for educating Wall Street. So just because we respect Regulation FD doesn't necessarily mean that we say nothing. In fact, we should have the patience and really the maturity to teach rather than just report. So Wall Street should be made aware, if you will, and the shareholder base should be made aware of the fact that actually things are moving forward better in a more positive way than we had actually anticipated. So I think given that sort of situation, positive discretion on the part of the comp committee is not viewed as negatively as it might be, even given 162M considerations. And if we have shorter-term measurement periods within that grand scheme of an annual report, then we should be able to accommodate and perhaps change metrics if necessary for the new reality. And, listen, management, this is where the softer side of metrics comes in. If management or the rest of the team, the entire company has worked very hard to implement something that, quite frankly, would detract from their short-term payouts, then there should be some reward for that. So I don't see any problem with positive discretion in a situation like this if Wall Street has been adequately informed and taught. And second, that a shorter term time, as Martin has advocated in the past, would be appropriate here to allow the committee some discretion in determining what should be awarded to management on a short-term basis.
And Martin, how have learnings from unexpected changes led management and the committee to do things differently in the future?
Well, Matt, again, I don't know all of the facts that went into this particular case study, but I mentioned earlier the modeling. So the sooner than expected or quicker, when I read that, I have to say that I would probably be holding myself accountable on that one, because it's my job to make sure that we are testing outside of the boundaries of what's expected. When we know the change is coming, we don't know, we won't know exactly how much the change is going to occur or when it's going to occur. So let's test the boundaries. I also think that Thermo Fisher tends to lean pretty heavily on making sure that the long-term incentive is counterbalancing what may be happening on the short-term side. We are a company that is very focused on shareholder return, and candidly, our stock price, I think, reflects it. So when we do have things that go against us, we're going to be making our decision, and the committee is going to be, we're going to help to guide the committee in terms of the governance process to think about what is going to have the most positive impact on long-term stock price. And if management is probably incented on the long term, which they are, then it should be okay if the cash element is not as strong as it otherwise would be. because the long-term element should pick that back up again. And so I think that we're guided by making sure that our compensation mix is appropriate, that our long-term incentive market basket of vehicles that we use excuse me, is appropriate, that we can then lean on those. But if those things are seen as not being adequate, then maybe we do something that is similar to what's being described here, where we think about, okay, so what are our alternatives here? Should we be doing something outside the box?
And I might add as well that, Martin, you have been an advocate for a balanced portfolio, if you will, of equity vehicles to use in a long-term plan. And I would say that that's a very smart move, and I would also include some equity component to the short-term plan, so that, even if the team misses goals related to cash incentive, then perhaps, they will still anticipate and feel empowered through the advantages they've created for themselves on a long-term basis or stock basis.
As we think about unexpected change and protecting our incentive programs from unexpected change, we've talked about having a plan. We've talked about making sure that there was some flexibility for the committee to administer the program, whether that was through strategic goals or semi-annual quantitative goals, and also a bit about balance. Karen, what other thoughts do you have on what committees can be doing to plan for and protect against unexpected change?
Well, I'll tell you, I am going to harp on this until I can't harp on it any longer, which is that the board should be quite coordinated, which doesn't always happen on most boards, and coordinated not only amongst themselves but also with management to understand what, from everyone's purview, could be the possible risks and opportunities, and therefore, what sort of change could be anticipated, or frankly, if unanticipated change happens, what philosophically do we want to do about that? If management is ever left wondering, then it means the board hasn't done its job, in my expectation. And senior leadership would feel the same way with their staff. If anyone is left wondering, then he or she has not been well managed. So I think that that's an important issue to begin with, and it starts with board leadership. Secondly, a balanced portfolio of equity instruments is really key, because where some equity instruments might show a short-term sort of downturn, the other equity instruments might still hold their value. And I think it's important to not say we just believe in stock options, or we only believe in restricted stock, or we only what have you. You can't just use one instrument. Feel free to use many, and to implement some of them in the short-term plan. So those are the things that I would add to this slide here.
Martin, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think that Karen hit on several of the aspects. I think that we want to make sure that there is that relationship that we've spoken of already, that's based on trust, and that the transparency that's being provided by management into the day-to-day operations is aligning the compensation committee and the full board around the way that the company is being run. I would encourage that we focus on the intermediate steps towards the long-term strategic goals, that North Star that Karen spoke of. And then that portfolio of equity instruments, the reason that's important is that it helps to balance the risk. We want to try to not overreact to short-term impact when we're talking about long-term programs. I know that none of us want to think about 2008, 2009 anymore, but it's not so long ago that there weren't lessons learned there. And candidly, we went through a process like many companies where the stock went from $63 to $36, and we had granted options at 57 that were brand new. Employees were feeling as if it was unmotivating to have these stock options. They were less than a year old at that stage, and had quite a long way to run. We weren't as balanced as we should have been. Thermo Fisher was a $2 billion company 10 years ago and is now $18 billion. So, we weren't quite the same company that we were then. We were overly dependent on stock options. And what we tried to do was to make sure that the leadership team and then the compensation committee understood that, look, we're not saying we're not going to cancel the options and reissue them, which was the strategy du jour. We're just saying that we're not going to yet. There's too long a period of time. Let's wait. And by the time that those $56 options expired, the stock price was $130 in 2015. And today we're at $166. So, I think that most people would love to have $57 options, and candidly, many still do. And what we try to do is make sure that we're staying focused on, like Karen described, that North Star, and keep on striving for TSR, and things will find a way to work their way through.
And Karen, in our earlier conversations, you mentioned the role of the board to really represent shareholders. That has to factor in here as well, right?
Absolutely. And quite honestly, I think that some boards sometimes lose sight of that. But really, for public companies, boards are hired by shareholders to look after the shareholders' best interests. And if the management team is incented with equity, then it should be the management team's best interest to do so also.
Well, even beyond the incentives, there's a moral obligation too. And I think I'm very fortunate. I've worked with leaders that that's the only thing that we're focused on. There isn't much operation of self-interest. Of course, we all want to do well. We all want to be properly compensated for what we bring. But our say on pay has been 97%, and I think that there are good reasons for that. I think we try to do the right things. I think we try to be, as I said, transparent, open, and honest, and I think we've really got a very strong relationship with a really involved and excellent compensation committee, where the outcomes that we wind up with are in keeping with what everybody wants, including the shareholders.
We are pushing up against the end of the hour, but we do have one question in the queue. How does the committee react when a change is such that it actually repositions the North Star?
That's an excellent question, and I think a number of industries are currently undergoing that sort of question. So I had mentioned retailers in the past, but retail is a great example of this. One could argue that the world is now over-retailed, especially here in the U.S. And what are retailers to do now that returns are dropping due to e-commerce and other factors? So I think that the committee, this should really be a much broader strategy discussion among the board, between the board and management team, and that a strategy should be developed, and that the incentive plan should follow strategy. So quite honestly, if the strategic goal is still to remain a retailer, to do everything in the same way that one has been doing, then the incentive plan should not change.
As we think about the key takeaways here, we talked a lot about the relationship and alignment and having one voice, and also this idea that planning for expected change really helps prepare the committee to handle unexpected change. Martin, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, Matt, I think that I hope that the points that we've touched on have been helpful to the audience, and I don't know whether there are any other questions that have come in through the chat, but I just think that what I would want to make sure that everyone is walking away with is the understanding that it is appropriate and in fact should be expected that committees hold management accountable. I don't think the committee should be the one that's feeling the pressure to make a decision. It has to be something that, we live this company every day. We know the company better. We should be bringing forward the correct solutions, and the committee should understand why they're the correct solutions with a high level of transparency. I think that's where you get into that partnership that winds up being where the shareholder benefits the most. We've done acquisitions where that wasn't exactly the way that things were run, and it's more difficult for us because we have to help the leadership team that we acquire to understand the way things are done here and the level of integrity that we operate in every single day. That's not always easy, but there's a reason that the company was available to be acquired. And generally speaking, those acquired executives have done extremely well here as well and had very good careers.
Karen, any final thoughts?
You know, I am a strong advocate for a revamp or a reconsideration of board leadership, and that, in my mind, and as I've described, would lead to a stronger relationship with management. And the only way to get through change, whether it's expected or unexpected, I think, as Martin agrees, is through an environment of trust between the board and management, and especially with respect to the comp committee. So I think that it's a key takeaway is to say to yourself, are we as board members managing our organization, our board leadership, our board composition as we would manage a management team if we were in the field? So there are certain principles that should apply to the board that boards have considered themselves immune to, and I think that that's just not correct.
Thanks, Karen. Well, we've reached the end of our hour. Thank you both again, Karen and Martin, for a very insightful discussion. And thank you as well to NACD New England. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Ellen for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for a thoughtful and provocative discussion. And a very special thank you to our panel members, Matt, Karen, and Martin, for sharing their perspective on the challenges of managing for both planned and unexpected change and its impact on incentives. A replay of the webcast will be available on both the NACD New England and the Perlmeyer website. You may also download today's presentation at the URL provided. For those who posted questions that were not answered during the webcast, Perlmeyer will be reaching out to you to provide more information. Please do take 5 minutes to fill out our post-event meeting evaluation. This is our first webinar, and we're looking to see whether we should continue these on an ongoing basis because we think they're wonderful for our constituents. We hope to see you at upcoming events in May and June. May and June breakfast topics are on crisis management and activist shareholders, respectively. And our Director Education Bootcamp events, one for experienced public company directors, and the second for those people who wish to sit on public company boards but have not yet done so. For more information and to register, please go to our NACD New England website. Thank you.